We're Tony and Chelsea Northrop, and thanks for watching our Flash video training series. First, a little math warning. In this episode, we're going to talk about Flash ratios, and this involves basic ratios and fractions and stops. And so if you can deal with like 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, you're gonna be okay. First of all, the Flash ratio discusses the ratio of the light output from the flash to the ambient light. So if your flash outputs exactly as much light as is hitting the background here, then you would call that a 1-to-1 ratio, like they're the same. If your flash outputs half as much light, then it's a 1-to-2 ratio. If your flash outputs twice as much light and overpowers the sun, then that could be a 2-to-1 ratio. Let me demonstrate each of these, and I'll show you a trick for really quickly getting to a 1-to-1 ratio. If your flash supports TTL, put it into TTL mode. Then put your camera into manual mode, and if you're comfortable adjusting your manual settings, then dial in your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to get the background exposed the way you want. Ignore your foreground subject completely, just get the background properly exposed. So first let me get a test shot without the flash, just properly exposing the background. For me, in this lighting, I was at 1/800th, ISO 100, and f2.8. And the background does look properly exposed, but the problem is the subject's face, Chelsea's face, is way too dark. This is what on-camera flash is really good at. It's going to add what we call fill flash. It's going to fill in those shadows. I'm going to leave it in TTL and fully auto mode. And what it's going to do is pick a 1-to-1 flash ratio by default since the camera's in manual mode. So let me take another picture. So that gives you a good sense of what a 1-to-1 flash ratio looks like. And because the background is so bright, her face is actually pretty bright too. It also steals a lot of contrast from the scene and makes it less interesting, but it did fill in those shadows. Now, let's just, for the sake of argument, decide that we want to go to a 2-to-1 ratio. We actually want it to be bright. To do that, because I'm in TTL mode here, I will dial the flash exposure compensation up. You know what, just to make the difference obvious, I'm gonna go up to 2 stops. So we're at +2 and I'll take another shot. As you can see, that's way too bright for my taste, but it does give it that sort of on-camera flash look that people sometimes use in fashion photography. But what I actually want is less on-camera flash, and that's almost always what I decide to do, is to dial it back a little bit. So we were at 2 stops above the ambient light. If we were at 1 stop, that would be twice as much light, putting us at a 2-to-1 ratio. But we went to +2 stops, which is actually a 4-to-1 ratio. This is where the math gets a little bit confusing. We are talking about ratios here, but when we convert it to stops, stops are, well, they're logarithmic. And what that means is each stop is a doubling or halving of light. So 2 stops doubles twice, or 2 times 2 is 4. That's why +2 stops flash exposure compensation is a 4-to-1 ratio. So let's go to -2 stops flash exposure compensation, which will be a 1-to-4 ratio, like 1/4 instead of 4/1. You can see the 1-to-4 flash ratio is a lot more pleasing, but now I think we might not have enough flash in there, so I'm going to adjust it up to a 1-to-2 flash ratio. And if you're paying careful attention and maybe you're inclined towards math, you might remember that this means I'm dialing in -1 stops of flash exposure compensation, because -1 is 1 full stop, or a 1-to-2 ratio. For me, I'm really happy with the 1-to-2 flash ratio, which is -1 stops of flash exposure compensation. So why is it important to understand these ratios? Well, you know, if you see a chef work, there's 2 different types of chefs. Some will just sort of sprinkle in a little bit of this and a little bit of that and then taste it and make adjustments as necessary. And then others kind of strictly follow a recipe and they measure everything out and make sure that it's just perfect. And using flash ratios allows you to follow recipes. It allows you to perfectly recreate pictures that have been taken before. This might seem terrible to you. If you're the creative type and you want everything just to be beautiful and you want to just feel it, that sounds bad. But imagine you're shooting corporate headshots for a website, and all of the executives are in different places, but they all want their pictures to look very similar. You could say, okay, I'm putting the camera off camera left with a 1:2 flash ratio, and then as you go to each different location, you could make sure that the pictures have a very similar look and look consistent. So for that reason, sometimes it is important to be able to follow recipes. You might also be a second shooter at a wedding. Imagine you're shooting alongside your dream photographer, somebody like Annie Leibovitz, and she wants you to reproduce her style so your pictures blend in with hers. And she might tell you that she uses a 2:1 flash ratio to get that sort of on-camera flash pop. Now you'll know exactly how to do that. Now, I've been working in manual mode and using TTL and flash exposure compensation, but the flash ratios work very similarly regardless of which modes that you're using. You just might have to adjust the flash a little bit differently. For example, if you're in full auto mode, it won't fire the flash at all, unless you're dark and it needs to add flash. If you're in program mode, the camera assumes that you know a little bit more about what you're doing, and by default, it will fire flash, but at a lower ratio. So I'm gonna leave this camera in TTL and then put it into program mode and take another shot, and we'll see how it looks. From those pictures, you can see program mode and aperture priority mode by default dialed in a little bit less flash, which was actually a little more pleasing. When I put it into full manual mode, I guess it assumed I knew what I was doing and gave me a 1:1 flash ratio by default. So if you are in manual mode, be aware that you might have to override that flash ratio and make some adjustments. Now that we've learned a little bit more about flash ratios and using manual exposure with your flash, I want to show you how to control the background brightness while keeping the foreground brightness basically the same. I took some pictures in manual mode with the flash in full auto, and it gave me a 1:1 flash ratio. If I want the background to be darker, what I'll do is I will dial in exposure compensation on the camera, negative exposure compensation. So I'm just going to go into aperture priority mode, and let's dial this down to -2 stops. Not the flash, but the camera is at -2 stops of flash exposure compensation. And then I'm going to leave the flash in TTL mode and full auto, and I'll take a picture. As you can see, when your flash is in TTL mode, adjusting the camera's exposure compensation adjusts both the ambient and the flash power, so the flash ratio stays the same, but the picture's brightness changes. Now I want to show you how you can use exposure compensation and flash exposure compensation together to control the brightness of your foreground subject and background. So you could have a bright background and a dark subject, or a dark background and a bright subject. For this, I'm going to put my camera into aperture priority mode, and I'm going to have the flash in TTL. I'm going to take 3 pictures, one with no exposure compensation on the camera, one with -2 stops, and one with -3 stops, so we can really see the extremes. For all of these shots, I'm keeping the flash exposure compensation set to 0, so the flash is in full auto. You can see in each of those 3 examples, the light ratio is the same. They all have a 1:1 light ratio. As I adjusted the camera's exposure compensation down, the flash also backed off. So the lighting in all of them was even. If you do want to adjust the lighting ratio in aperture priority mode, what you can do is to simultaneously adjust the camera's exposure compensation and the flash's flash exposure compensation. And I'm going to do so in opposite directions. I want a dark background. So on the camera, I'm going to dial in the exposure compensation to -3. Remember, the camera controls the ambient light, the background lighting. And then on the flash, I want the subject to be properly exposed, so I have to add 3 stops of exposure compensation. The camera is at -3, the flash is at +3, which means it's now back to 0. -3 + 3 = 0. So let's take another shot. By the way, I'm using on-camera flash to simplify these examples, and it's not producing the most pleasing results. Other tutorials will show you how to get more flattering light by using light modifiers and off-camera flash. So in that example, you can see that even though she is actually in a heavily backlit situation, I was able to completely flip the script and make the background darker than the foreground subject by adjusting the background brightness using the camera's exposure compensation and the foreground brightness using the flash's exposure compensation. Remember, flash starts with an F and foreground starts with an F. That's how you can remember how those work. These same concepts can be applied in basically any camera mode. If you don't have TTL, you can adjust it manually. It just means that it might take you a couple of test shots to get things right. I hope these tutorials are being helpful to you. And you know, this was a particularly technically complex tutorial, and you don't have to master this right away. You don't have to figure out the ratios and the math behind it, because you always have the option of just taking a test shot and then adjusting it from there. But over time, if you don't get it today, then practice some and come back to it, because once you develop that muscle memory, once you develop the feel for flash, adding on extra layers like the technicality of it and the mathematics of the flash will improve your understanding, and it'll get a lot easier, I promise. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Bye.